Do you feel like something is wrong, but you don't know exactly what? As if your home has lost its peace? As if your heart carries a weight that isn't yours? Maybe there will be no shouting, no insults. But there is the biased view, the whispered comment, the envy that surrounds, the murmuring that sets in like a slow poison. And when you least expect it, everything starts to go wrong. Plants dry up, relationships wear out, sleep eludes you. This is not just a bad phase, it is a spiritual battlefield. But there is a key, a psalm written in the midst of persecution, where each word is like a sword, shield, and prayer. A text that not only consoles, but confronts. A psalm that has the power to change atmospheres, cut hidden ties, and restore the peace that was stolen from you. Stay with me until the end, and you will understand why this psalm can be the spiritual weapon your soul has been silently asking for. There was a simple, discreet woman who lived in a house surrounded by low walls and doors that were always open. She devoted herself to her home and her children, and treated her neighbors with kindness. Nothing in her routine seemed out of the ordinary, until small signs began to appear. Plants that had previously flourished withered overnight. Pets began to fall ill for no apparent reason. The air in the house became heavier, arguments increased, and her sleep became restless. That was when she realized that something beyond logic was interfering with her peace. There were no declared enemies. There was no crime, no guilt, no visible explanation. Just a growing discomfort that had no name but was felt intensely. The woman, without knowing exactly how, understood that she was fighting a battle that her eyes could not see. A silent battle, fought not with weapons, but with words, intentions, and presence. It was as if an external force was trying to dismantle what she built every day. How often does this also happen to people who don't fit the profile of conflict? People who don't harm anyone, but find themselves surrounded by anguish, loss, and blockages with no logical explanation. There is an answer to this, and it is not hidden in self-help books or popular theories about bad luck. It is in the scriptures, in the ancient records of men and women who also faced the invisible with faith, resilience, and spiritual understanding. The question that arises is straightforward. Why do some people's lives begin to fall apart even when they do everything right? The answer may be uncomfortable, but it needs to be stated clearly. There are spiritual realities that operate outside of reason, and ignoring them does not prevent them from affecting us. Just as not seeing the wind does not mean that it is not blowing. What is at stake is the understanding that part of the struggle we face is not material, but spiritual, and it requires a stance aligned with this truth. Over time, many have been exposed to this type of nameless oppression. And when we talk about oppression, we are not talking about something abstract, but rather pressures that arise in the form of persistent sadness, unexplained delays, confusion in relationships, constant heaviness in the environment, and a sequence of situations that seem to sap one's strength little by little. It is as if the person is carrying a burden that is not theirs, but was placed on them without permission. So what should we do? How can we resist when we cannot see the aggressor? The answer is not to react impulsively or to seek solutions using the same tools we use to solve common problems. There is a deeper path, a path that involves spiritual clarity, the practice of active faith, and the understanding of principles that are not always visible to the eye, but are accessible to the heart. This is where the value of a psalm like the 59th comes in. Unlike a common devotional reading, it carries the strength of a cry that spans the centuries. It was not written by a man in comfort, but by someone who, cornered, sought help from enemies who multiplied not only with swords, but with words, with conspiracies, with traps that came disguised as cordiality. This psalm is not soft poetry. It is a call to spiritual resistance, and reading it changes the atmosphere because it was written on the battlefield. The first key to understanding the impact of this type of confrontation is to recognize that it exists. We only fight what we admit. Denial is often the first trap. When we think that everything is psychological or merely circumstantial, we close the door to spiritual action. But when one recognizes that there is something else going on, that there is a strange atmosphere dominating the environment, the first step towards liberation has already been taken. And this is not superstition or irrational belief. It is discernment based on scripture and supported by human experience. When David wrote his words asking for deliverance, he was not just dealing with soldiers. He was dealing with betrayals, accusations, and persecutions from within and without. And yet he chose not to remain silent. He chose to speak out. He chose to face what others preferred to ignore. Many of the obstacles we face today follow the same logic. They cannot be explained by objective factors. And the more we try to resolve them through natural means, the more they intensify. It is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The root of the problem lies in a plan that requires a different type of positioning. A positioning that begins with recognition, continues through proclamation, and is consolidated in the constancy of faith. At this point, all that is asked is that listening be open. Let the barriers of haste, skepticism, or distraction be cast aside for a moment. Because what will be said next has the power not only to clarify, but to transform. It's not just about information, it's about revelation. One of those that touches where reasoning cannot reach. The kind that confronts without attacking, and lets go without needing to understand all the reasons. When the truth presents itself, it finds resonance. Even if not everything is yet understood, the Spirit recognizes what is real. And what is being revealed here is the existence of a war that may have been going on for a long time, without a name, without an explanation, but with clear consequences. And now, it needs to be faced with the right weapons. Some battles begin without noise. They are silent, subtle, and almost imperceptible in the first few days. But the signs appear. The house loses its shine. The Spirit disappears for no clear reason. Previously stable relationships become grounds for constant conflict. The body tires more quickly, the mind becomes distracted, and the routine gradually becomes disorganized. The most common thing in these moments is to look for external causes: traffic, work, financial crisis, stress. But there are situations in which none of these justifications hold up. And when this happens, it is necessary to consider that the root of the problem may lie on another level. The Bible is a book that has never treated the spiritual as something abstract. On the contrary, it presents the invisible world as real and active. In Proverbs, it is written that life and death are in the power of the tongue. In the book of James, the tongue is compared to fire that sets an entire forest ablaze. This is not an empty metaphor. It is a direct warning about the power that words carry when they are spoken with destructive intent. In everyday life, few people realize the impact that a comment, a look, or an attitude filled with envy can have. Envy, contrary to what many people think, is not just a harmless feeling. It has a direct effect on the atmosphere where it is fed. It doesn't need to be pronounced to act. Just be present. And where it settles, the balance begins to collapse. The Portuguese writer Father Antonio Vieira, already in the 17th century, stated that the poison of envy does not kill all at once, but gradually sickens the spirit. This poison can be present in false compliments, in advice loaded with double meanings, or even in silences that speak louder than words. And one of the most common forms of its manifestation is murmuring. Murmuring is the language of the dissatisfied. It is almost always done in secret, in a low voice, with an appearance of concern, but full of judgment. And when it is directed at someone, it creates an atmosphere of disagreement, of heaviness, of unrest. The impact may not be felt immediately, but it repeats itself with increasing frequency and intensity. And over time, it turns into a kind of invisible pressure that limits, blocks, paralyzes. In Hebrew culture, the ancients already treated the tongue as a sacred instrument. That is why they were so alert about being careful with what they said. In the Talmud, there are records that indicate that a word can uplift or destroy a soul. This ancient wisdom is not superstition, it is refined spiritual perception. What is spoken has the power to create, to liberate, to chain, or to set free. And it is not just about words spoken directly to a person. Words spoken about them, even in their absence, reverberate. Modern science is already beginning to touch on this understanding. Research in the field of energy psychology shows that environments where there is tension, gossip, and constant accusations directly affect the immune system of those present. A study conducted by Stanford University in 2017 showed that frequent exposure to toxic environments increases cortisol levels and reduces the ability to concentrate, empathize, and respond emotionally in a balanced way. Still, many people live in these contexts thinking that everything can be solved with mental effort. But there are levels at which emotional strength alone is not enough. Because the root is spiritual. It is not just the environment that is charged. It is the atmosphere that has been contaminated by cursed words, hostile feelings, and hidden desires for failure. In some homes, this spiritual burden has become part of the routine. There are those who think it is normal to live in constant conflict, with objects being broken over and over, illnesses that come and go without a clear clinical cause, fights that seem to repeat the same cycle without ever finding a solution. These signs, when added together, indicate that there is something else at work. And this something cannot be resolved with explanations, but with discernment. Discerning is perceiving what lies beyond appearances. It is recognizing that not all envy comes from declared enemies. Sometimes it comes disguised as friendship. It comes with a smile, with a feigned question of interest, with an inopportune reminder. And when it finds a gap, it takes hold. Envy does not need a reason. It feeds on what the other person carries, even if it is discreet. It is silent, but corrosive. And the worst part is that envy does not go it alone. It attracts other elements of the same field: malicious criticism, comparison, gossip, the hidden desire to see the other person fall. This accumulation not only contaminates, but also opens the door to other denser forces. When this cycle is not interrupted, the person begins to feel exhausted without understanding why. It is at this point that it becomes necessary to recognize that there are spiritual influences at work. It's not about creating paranoia or living in fear. It's about being aware, because what is not understood cannot be fought, and what is not fought takes hold. What begins as a simple sideways glance can evolve into cursing words, directed thoughts, and silent actions loaded with negative intent. The scriptures make it clear that the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth to strengthen those who belong to him. But they also show that there are those who desire evil even without apparent reason. This was the case with David, who wrote of enemies who persecuted him without cause, who plotted his destruction while feigning peace. His experience was not isolated. It reflects what many still face today. The strength of these influences lies not only in their direct action, but in the constancy with which they operate. Repeatedly, with small blows, they undermine the resistance of the victim until he begins to doubt himself, his faith, his strength. Spiritual oppression sets in first as confusion and then as resignation. When the person begins to accept as normal living in permanent tension, the field has already been compromised. Therefore, understanding the spiritual origin of these blockages is more than a step towards enlightenment. It is an act of resistance. It is the decision not to accept the invisible as inevitable. It is positioning oneself with clarity and authority, understanding that there is a solution, but it will not come from human strategies, but rather from an alignment with spiritual principles that have real power to transform environments and break invisible chains. Recognizing that there are forces at work in the invisible is the first step. But knowing how to confront them is what truly defines the direction of victory. In ancient times, people who understood the spiritual dimensions knew that it was not enough to name the enemy. They needed to know which weapon to use. Among all the texts left as a spiritual legacy, the psalm written by David in one of the most distressing moments of his life stands out for its strength in direct confrontation. He did not compose words to console, but to confront. This psalm is not limited to a plea for help. It is an act of resistance, a cry from someone who was surrounded but not surrendered. The language used by David is one of urgency and intensity. He does not address God as someone in doubt, but as a soldier crying out for justice against enemies who move in the shadows. And this already shows us that prayer is not, in its essence, a passive practice. It is an active declaration of position in the face of that which opposes the purpose of life. If what you're hearing so far makes sense to you, leave an amen in the comments. That way I'll know that you're following along and that this message is coming at the right time. The first words of this psalm are a direct call for deliverance. The request to be protected from those who rise up against him is not symbolic. It represents the reality of someone who recognizes that he is at risk for reasons that escape human logic. This expression reveals that there are situations in which what is at stake is not only the emotional well-being, but also the very spiritual integrity of the person who is the target of persistent attacks. The text goes further when it states that those who plot evil act without cause. This is one of the most difficult characteristics to understand: the unjust attack. Many people suffer not because they have done something wrong, but precisely because they carry something that bothers them. This makes Psalm 59 a weapon for those who face opposition, not as a consequence of mistakes, but because they carry something that others cannot bear to see flourish. Each verse functions as a line of defense, but also as a spiritual counteroffensive. David does not just plead, he denounces. He describes what is being done in the shadows, reveals the strategy of the adversaries, and cries out for a divine response that goes beyond consolation. He asks for action, justice, real deliverance. This transforms the psalm into a kind of verbal shield. It is not just prayer, it is spiritual weaponry. The historical context in which this psalm was written reinforces its power. David was the target of persecution by Saul, who had allowed himself to be dominated by jealousy, envy, and fear of losing the throne. And it was precisely in this scenario that David hid, prayed, and wrote. His words came from a place of pain, but also of revelation. He understood that it was not enough to hide physically. He needed to shield himself spiritually. The psalm describes enemies that move like dogs, prowling at night, looking for an opportunity to attack. This image is extremely accurate when applied to modern spiritual dynamics. There are forces that do not appear in the light of day. They act in moments of vulnerability, in silence, in the absence of vigilance. They are subtle, continuous attacks that wait for the person to let their guard down. This detail reveals an important principle. There are situations in which what determines protection is not the absence of attack, but the firmness of defense. Psalm 59 teaches that the secret is not in avoiding being a target, but in being spiritually armed so as not to be defeated. And this requires more than repeated words. It requires understanding, positioning, and active faith. The content of the psalm also points to a kind of faith that is not limited to waiting. It is the faith that cries out with authority, that expresses itself in firm words, without hesitation, that treats God not as someone distant, but as an ally present on the battlefield. When David invokes the God of hosts, he is activating a specific dimension of who God is, not the tender shepherd, but the warrior who stands up for his own. This aspect is essential for those who face pressures that have no rational explanation, because what is being attacked is not just the body, nor just the routine, but the spiritual identity. And when this happens, it is necessary to connect with the face of God who fights, who judges, who protects. The psalm therefore becomes a call to activate this protection. Each verse is a blade against cursed words. Each stanza is a barrier against envy. Each statement is a shield against the energies launched to sabotage progress. Furthermore, the psalm alternates between denunciation and worship. There are moments when David clearly describes what his enemies are doing. At other times, he extols God's faithfulness. This movement reveals that spiritual combat cannot be done only with lament, but also with praise. Worship, in this context, is not an emotional relief. It is an act of war. It is the response that breaks cycles of oppression and establishes dominion over the environment. In proclaiming that God is his refuge, David is not merely comforting himself. He is activating a spiritual covering. He declares the place where his soul takes shelter, the space where no contrary word has power, the territory where no arrow reaches. This teaches us that protection is not just a divine promise. It is a conscious posture of faith, activated in prayer and sustained by the constancy of confession. And the more constant the confession, the stronger the shield becomes. It is not a matter of repeating words automatically, but of declaring truths with understanding. This is what makes the psalm a spiritual key. It is not an amulet, it is a strategy. When proclaimed with faith, with understanding, with inner alignment, it changes the environment, deactivates attacks, and strengthens the spirit. This spiritual dimension, often ignored, is what sustains people in the midst of crises that no one understands. It is what keeps those who no longer have human support standing. And it is in these kinds of words, written in a time of persecution, that we find the necessary resource for those who today face invisible but real pressures. Psalm 59 is not a prayer for calm times. It is for those who have already understood that they are at war and can no longer fight with conventional weapons. When the words of Psalm 59 are used as protection against external attacks, it is inevitable to realize that there is an even more delicate front to be strengthened: the interior. The mental field often becomes the most vulnerable target in the face of invisible pressures. Even with constant prayers, consecrated environments, and firm attitudes, there are times when the mind insists on reproducing thoughts that are not in line with spiritual truth. It is in this silent space, where no one else sees, that the most decisive battles take place. The mind can be a haven of peace or a territory occupied by persistent noises. A recurring thought, no matter how subtle it may seem, can turn into a sentence. A mean comment, even if said years ago, can still resonate strongly when you haven't been confronted with the truth. And that's how wear and tear sets in. Not with big explosions, but through small, continuous repetitions, like drops that gradually break the structure from the inside out. It is common for an individual to begin to doubt themselves after facing external pressure for a while. Phrases like, "Nothing works for me," "I don't think I can do it," "Maybe the problem is in me," appear without warning. These thoughts do not appear out of nowhere. They are the result of accumulations, untreated wounds, and cursed words that have found space and begun to take root. Psychology studies show that repeating negative ideas forms mental patterns that are difficult to break because the brain seeks familiarity. Even constant pain, if repeated for long enough, can become part of everyday functioning. That is why it is so urgent to identify the thoughts that are becoming a prison before they are accepted as absolute truths. From a spiritual perspective, thoughts are not just mental constructs. They are also doors that open to faith or fear, to courage or discouragement. When the mind is fed by voices of guilt, rejection, or failure, these ideas not only generate sadness, but affect decisions, weaken prayer, and distort the perception of reality. There are those who live tormented by memories, by words that were uttered in a moment of anger, by comparisons that established a sense of inadequacy. These inner voices gain strength in the absence of healing. And the more silent the pain, the stronger the emotional impact becomes. There are people who no longer pray with faith, not because they have stopped believing, but because they have convinced themselves that they do not deserve to be heard. The psalmist, in declaring that God is his strength and refuge, is not just making an argument. He is confronting what his own soul might be saying. He is consciously choosing which thoughts to entertain. He is retraining his mind in the midst of chaos. This is a powerful spiritual practice, declaring divine truths until they replace emotional lies. When we say that the mind needs to be renewed, we are not talking about an intellectual effort alone. It is a spiritual realignment, where thoughts are subjected to what God says and not to what feelings dictate. It is a process that requires persistence, vigilance, and above all, clarity. Because while the external enemy attacks with actions, the internal enemy attacks with narratives. And, if they are not undone, these narratives shape behavior, impede progress, and imprison identity. Emotional healing begins when you identify the thought that hurts you the most. When you have the courage to say, "This voice is not mine. This guilt does not belong to me. This fear was not created by God." And from that, a new cycle begins. A cycle where the mind stops being a field of attack and becomes a space of rest, where silence is no longer filled with insecurity, but with certainty. This process can be slow. Not every thought is immediately dissolved, but each time a truth is proclaimed, a space is closed for lies. Each time a word of life is repeated, a root of pain is weakened. This is how strength is rebuilt. Not by the strength of the arm, but by the constancy of inner renewal. As thoughts begin to be reordered, the inner change is inevitably reflected in the environment. A free mind leads the body to new attitudes, and these attitudes directly impact the space in which one lives. The house, which previously seemed silent but full of tension, begins to be seen as a territory that also needs to be guarded, not by physical locks or bolts, but by spiritual principles applied regularly. Home is more than walls and furniture. It is an extension of the emotional and spiritual life of those who live there. Therefore, it is not uncommon for the environment to feel colder and heavier in times of instability, as if the space were responding to what is happening inside people. This reflection is real, not in mystical terms, but in the way energies are generated, exchanged and absorbed by daily attitudes, conversations, and the way time is invested within this space. Spiritual discipline emerges as an essential path to restoring and maintaining peace within the home. And discipline here does not mean empty ritualism or automatic repetitions. It is an intentional constancy, a conscious choice to transform the place where one lives into a point of protection, not only physical, but spiritual. It is at this point that prayer assumes a function that goes beyond petition. It becomes an act of protection. Praying indoors, in a clear voice, is not just devotion, it is delimitation of territory. When it is declared that a dwelling is consecrated, that there is no room there for oppression, murmuring, or confusion, a barrier is created against everything that wants to infiltrate and steal harmony. And this prayer may be simple, but it needs to be done with understanding. The more frequent, the more solid the spiritual shielding of that space becomes. Another key to completely transforming the environment is forgiveness. Although it is often seen as something internal, forgiveness also has a collective effect. Carrying resentments, even if they are not spoken, contaminates the air in the home. A grudge kept silent does not stop acting just because it is not expressed. It lodges in looks, tone of voice, and emotional distance. And when this accumulates among the residents of the same home, the environment becomes heavy, opaque, and disconnected from peace. Forgiving is more than just releasing the other person. It is untying one's own knots. It is breaking the bonds that bind the soul to the episode that caused harm. And spiritually, forgiveness is also a breaking of an agreement. Because every time the memory of an unhealed pain is kept alive, an invisible connection is created with the situation and the person involved. Breaking this bond is part of the liberation. Furthermore, practicing forgiveness paves the way for one of the most neglected aspects of spiritual life, restoring the space in which one lives. A home should not only be a place of shelter, but also of healing. Protecting the home requires practical actions that demonstrate spiritual authority over that environment. Reading sacred texts aloud, consecrating rooms with words of blessing, and removing objects, content, or practices that open the door to negative influence are all actions that reinforce this authority. It is not about fear or superstition. It is about spiritual governance. A disorganized space, full of tension, where violent content is constantly consumed or where gossip is allowed to prevail, becomes vulnerable. In contrast, an environment where truth, prayer, and forgiveness are cultivated becomes stronger. The atmosphere changes, even if externally everything seems the same. This spiritual shielding of the home is even more powerful when done with purpose. Upon waking, declare words of life. During the day, keep your spirit attentive to what is spoken and shared. And at night, before going to bed, renew the commitment that the home remains under superior protection. These gestures, repeated with intention, build an invisible but impenetrable resistance. What is built in the invisible becomes visible over time, and whoever plants peace reaps balance. Those who practice prayer with discernment and sincerely release forgiveness transform their own home into a refuge, a place where the soul rests, the mind calms, and the spirit finds shelter. The silent discipline of protecting the environment in which one lives generates effects that go beyond what one can immediately perceive. Over time, what was once just resistance becomes habit. What started as an effort becomes a natural practice, and the home, which previously seemed just a physical space, becomes a territory marked by presence, clarity, and stability. This process of reconstruction, both internally and around us, is not the result of a single gesture, but of the constancy of small, conscious decisions. Each prayer said with sincerity, each forgiveness granted even without recognition, each contrary word that was rejected before finding shelter. All of this adds up as part of a structure that supports those who choose to remain firm even when everything around them seems uncertain. Liberation does not only happen through shouting or large demonstrations. Sometimes it reveals itself in the silence that no longer oppresses, but heals. In an environment that no longer weighs, but is welcoming. In thoughts that no longer accuse, but guide. There are times when the miracle does not manifest itself with lights, but with lightness. And that, in itself, is a sign that something has changed profoundly. There is no need to wait for major signs to know that the transformation has begun. Just observe the details. The way the mind responds to situations that previously caused anxiety. The way the environment effortlessly reorganizes itself. The peace that arrives without logical explanation. These are evidence that the invisible is already reorganizing itself. And when the invisible changes, everything around it follows suit. The divine presence, when welcomed with reverence and intention, not only visits, but dwells. And where it remains, no opposing force finds space. This does not mean that challenges cease, but that the way we face them changes. What was once a cause for fear is now faced with wisdom. What once generated insecurity is now dealt with authority. Often the greatest battles are not won with noise, but with determination. And firmness comes from understanding, knowing who you are, what you carry, and who is by your side. Psalm 59 was not written to be read in a hurry, but to be absorbed as a sustained statement of confidence, endurance, and protection. It is not just an answer to a moment of distress, but a foundation for a life that refuses to be shaped by oppression. Once you understand the depth of what is at stake, it becomes impossible to live as before. Choices change. The eye becomes more attentive, the mind filters itself, and home becomes an extension of this new understanding. Peace, then, ceases to be a vague desire and becomes a constant presence. Not because there is no fight, but because there is a shield. Let it be recorded. What is not confronted is accommodated. But what is exposed to the light of truth loses strength. The decision to close cycles, declare protection, and keep spiritual consciousness alive transforms not only circumstances, but also generations. Because everything that is broken today no longer weighs on those who come after. It won't always be easy. There won't always be understanding from those around you. But there will be fruit. There will be direction. And there will be rest. The question that remains is simple. If war has already been identified and weapons are available, what will be your choice from now on? Because even silence carries an answer, and your stance will define whose voice will prevail from now on. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.